And Ahilan Kadirgamar is a spokesperson of the Sri Lanka Democracy Forum and a contributing editor of Himal South Asian magazine, which maybe you have copies.
I've got a few copies there.
In that capacity, he's worked on the peace process in Sri Lanka. His concerns have included the need for state reform in Sri Lanka, particularly a political solution to the ethnic conflict through the devolution of power and constitutional reform, addressing the grievances and aspirations of the minorities. He's written about the international dimension of the peace process and worked on human rights concerns related to the conflict.
Thank you. And thank you to the organizers for this opportunity to meet all of you and to have an exchange. I think I'll try to be brief. I'll start with just the current situation because it's hard to avoid talking about the current situation given the humanitarian catastrophe on the ground. But I'll save much of it for discussion after all of us speak, because I'm sure all of you have specific questions. So the bulk of my talk, I'm going to focus on how Sri Lanka is going to be framed after this war in terms of security and development, what the international community would attempt to do, what are the problems with it, and how should those of us in the left engage with that. You're probably watching the news. You know that over the last few months, there's been a tremendous amount of violence on the ground. Thousands of people have died. Just the ICRC itself claims they've evacuated about 10,000 injured since January. So that gives you a sense of the scale of the violence. And at this point, there's been a lot of change even over the last few days. Estimates vary, but anywhere from 60,000 to 100,000 people have come out of that very small patch of land, probably now about 10 square kilometers. But there's still tens of thousands of people stuck there. The military continues its offensive. There's shelling. A lot of people have died from the shelling. On the other hand, the LTT is also holding that population hostage. They've shot at people who try to flee. So the civilian situation is of serious concern. And as this war comes to an end, and hopefully it won't lead to any further loss of life, and we can talk about what recommendations different people have put out, even at this urgent moment, to address the humanitarian situation. As the war comes to an end, what next is the big question. What's going to happen in Sri Lanka, given the history of state oppression, the question of minorities. And here, taking off from what Rohini outlined in terms of left engagement and left politics over the last 60 years since independence, the terrain is very different. At this particular moment, when we go into what the international community will call post-conflict, right? I don't like that term post-conflict, but that's how they're going to characterize it in a few weeks when this conventional war is over. It is a different terrain altogether. After the fall of the Soviet Union, in the post-1989 environment, there's been an emphasis on security and development, right? In a unipolar world, in the context of the American empire, the emphasis is on global governance, as they would like to think of it. And the emphasis is on how do you have security and stability so that there could be the kind of development, the kind of neoliberal development policies that we have seen. And Sri Lanka has kind of been the laboratory of a number of experiments, I would say, even for the West. So Rohini mentioned after 1977 and the Jayawardeneh regime, the acceleration of liberalization well before the Washington Consensus. So we saw that Sri Lanka was in the lead, even though in the 70s we had very high social indices in terms of education, welfare, and so on. Then in 2002, it was a highly internationalized peace process where this new framework of conflict resolution was used to address the problem. And if you follow some of the international relations political science literature, that is a very dominant paradigm now. And I would say that going forward, there is going to be now this emphasis on security and development. And what is that framework of security and development which has been reinforced by the war on terror rhetoric and framework, which in many ways is here to stay, right? There has been a lot of resistance to it, but if you look at what's going on within South Asia, it's entrenched. So even if there is calls, or even if the Obama administration starts to reduce that language, it's entrenched globally. So one example is that if you look at the SARC, for example, and the last 2 years, the bulk of the SARC statements, the emphasis is on the war on terror. And the other aspect is, of course, trade and development. So it's in this kind of context where the war on terror, this idea of security and development have been entrenched. What are the possibilities in terms of addressing the political concerns of minorities in Sri Lanka? And that's what I mean by the shift in terrain. And I think Rohini articulated what the left in Sri Lanka traditionally called the national question. But that has been, like any other discourse, it changes over time, over history. There's been a lot of debates, and what in Sri Lanka we call the devolution debate. That itself has changed, the language has changed. Often outside observers, or even some people inside, might take a very dogmatic view of what the national question means. But there has been interpretations and reinterpretations of it as history has been changing. And I think it's important. So it's in that context that I also situate Rohini's concern about overemphasizing the right to self-determination. And so this historical debate, which grounded the grievances and aspirations of the minorities, is what is commonly now called a political solution or the devolution debate. But along with that, the second important point when I think of what are the political concerns that have to be addressed is the need for some form of democratization or participation of the peoples of all the communities. And the two are very much tied together, the idea of democratization and a political solution. And in the Sri Lankan context, when we talk about a political solution, it normally means substantial devolution of power to the regions, as well as some interlocking mechanism whereby there is power sharing at the center, such as a second chamber. And along with that, of course, concerns of language policy, better access to education and employment. While this might seem overly constitutional in its framing, you have to keep in mind that this is part of a debate. It's a part of a debate that also attempts to challenge the nationalisms on both sides, singular Buddhist nationalism and Tamil nationalism, by concretizing this debate around constitutional reform. And it's in this context that the recent shifts around the use of the war on terror and along with that security and development are worrying, because the donors have been pushing this quite a bit, security and development. And in a country like Sri Lanka, the international donors have a huge amount of impact. A large part of our economy is shaped by donor engagement. And the interesting thing about the war on terror rhetoric, and this relates to the very highly internationalized Norwegian peace process that took place, is that if you remember, Bush, a year after September 11th, came out and said that there were two things. On the one side was the war on terror. On the other hand was the idea, the concept called failed state. Right? So for the Bush regime, failed states breed terrorism. That's how they framed it. And the Norwegians, when they engaged with the peace process in Sri Lanka, they also framed it along those lines. That in Sri Lanka, you had the problem of terrorism in the post-September 11th context of the LTTE. But the Sri Lankan state was a failed state. And their idea was to solve the two problems by getting these two actors to speak to each other, the LTTE and the Sri Lankan state, and thereby to bring about some amount of stability, which in their terms meant security and therefore development. So that was the way in which they framed it. And of course, the idea of the failed state it's very much a neo-colonial concept that comes from the opposition to decolonization, that the peoples in the third world cannot rule themselves, and it continues now, and even some of the human rights language sometimes gets appropriated into saying that these states don't address the human rights of the local population, but the thrust is towards shaping the state. And the ironic thing about the concept of the failed state is that it is set up to fail. So you make sure that the state cannot provide services, so you push for privatization, you cut social welfare, so that what's left of the state is just the coercive apparatuses of the state.